Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to try to unpack a very complex case, the story of Malik Samartaney.
Oh, yeah.
Now, if you're at all interested in true crime, you may have heard that name. But we're going beyond the headlines. We're
Okay.
going to look at this guy's life, his crimes, and really ask that difficult question, could any of this have been prevented?
Yeah, I think that's the crucial question. I mean, this isn't just a case study. It's an opportunity to examine all these factors that contribute to cycles of violence and, try to understand the challenges of stopping them.
That's right, and we've got quite a bit to cover. Court records, tons of news articles, even some firsthand accounts from people who knew him. We're trying to piece together this puzzle that spans, like, decades.
And it's a puzzle that starts with a really chilling mystery. So in 2006, Lisa Brown and her 9-month-old daughter, Labria,
Oh, wow.
were found murdered in their home. And the prime suspect, the boyfriend of Lisa's mother, a man who had recently changed his name to Malik Samartaney.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got a potential double homicide and a name change, which to me always kind of throws up a red flag. What happened next?
Well, despite the suspicion surrounding him, they never charged Malik.
Hmm.
There just wasn't enough evidence.
Okay.
And it would be years before justice caught up with him, but to really understand how he managed to evade justice for so long, we need to go all the way back to the beginning.
All right, let's rewind. Where does this story actually begin?
So Malik Samartaney was born Lawrence Banks back in 1953.
Okay.
And his early life, it was marked by violence. His first documented act of aggression was targeted at his own family. In 1975, he assaults his wife, Vivian, even held a knife to her throat at one point.
Oh, geez.
Now, she initially reported this,
Oh, okay.
but later she dropped the charges.
I think this is such a crucial point. Why would someone drop charges after something so serious? We see this a lot in domestic violence cases. It really speaks to those complex dynamics of control and fear that can just trap victims.
Right, exactly. Leaving an abusive relationship, it's almost never simple. There could be financial dependence, fear of retaliation, even emotional manipulation.
And sadly, just a few months later, things take an even darker turn.
Tragically, Vivian was found dead that same year,
Oh, no.
under very suspicious circumstances. And although Lawrence, as he was known then, was a suspect, they never brought charges due to the state of decomposition of the body.
So another potential murder, another example of how incredibly hard it could be to get convictions in domestic violence cases, especially when you don't have that physical evidence.
Absolutely. But that same year, Lawrence did commit a crime that would finally land him behind bars.
Okay.
He assaulted his 7-month-old daughter, Dominique, threw her through a glass door.
Wow. I mean, it's hard to even fathom that level of violence directed at a helpless infant. What happened to Dominique after the attack?
She survived, thankfully. But this just brutal act, it resulted in his first conviction, sentenced to 15 years in prison for assault with intent to murder.
15 years? For something so horrific. I mean, you would think that would be some kind of turning point, like a wake-up call, right? But as we already know, this story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't. And his release from prison in 1988, well, it wouldn't mark the end of his violent tendencies either. It was just the beginning of a new and even more terrifying chapter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. He's out of prison, and within a few years, more violence. It's like this horrifying pattern, that just keeps repeating.
Right. Yeah, it's a classic example of what criminologists call the cycle of violence. And sadly, for a lot of offenders, violence, it becomes a learned behavior. It's a way of exerting control, dealing with conflict, and, without really effective intervention, this cycle, it can continue for years, even decades.
And in Lawrence's case, or Malik as he's now known, this cycle just escalates to an unimaginable level in 1991.
Yeah, in 91, his teenage daughter, Dominique, and his son, Lawrence Jr., they both come forward with accusations of abuse against him. Dominique even alleges sexual assault.
That's just incredibly disturbing. It seems like he was targeting, like, the most vulnerable people in his life, the people he should have been protecting. What happened after these accusations?
Instead of facing any consequences, his violence just intensifies. Just a few months after those accusations, in a fit of rage, he fatally shoots his drinking buddy, Michael Chisholm. And then, tragically, just hours later, he murders his own son, Lawrence Jr.
It's hard to even process that. He killed his own son, a son who had just accused him of abuse. It's a level of brutality that's difficult to comprehend.
This case really highlights the devastating consequences of, unchecked anger, and the tragic reality of domestic violence turning fatal. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of this, deeply disturbing pattern of behavior that had been going on for years, escalating for years.
And this time justice did prevail, at least to some extent.
Yes. In 1992, he was convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder, sentenced to another 20 years in prison.
20 years, that's a significant sentence. Do we know anything about, like, what happened during his time in prison? Was there any attempt at rehabilitation? Any indication that he might have changed his ways?
Prison records, they're not always accessible, for privacy reasons, but it's worth noting that recidivism rates, meaning the likelihood of reoffending, are unfortunately pretty high for violent offenders. It points to kind of a systemic problem, I think. We focus so much on punishment, not enough on rehabilitation, right? And if you don't address those underlying causes of violence, the cycle's likely to continue.
It's a sobering thought, and it leads us to another turning point in this story. His release in 2002, he changes his name again to Malik Samartaney, get out of prison, and within just a few years, the violence resumes. This time, it's directed at his girlfriend's daughter, Lisa Brown, who is brave enough to, take legal action against him.
You're right to highlight Lisa's courage. Seeking a protective order is often such a critical step for victims of domestic violence. It's a legal tool. It can provide that barrier between the victim and the abuser and potentially save lives.
Can you maybe explain what a protective order is and how it works?
Sure. A protective order, also known as a restraining order, it's a court order that prohibits an abuser from contacting or even coming near the victim. It's designed to prevent further harassment, threats, or violence. Violating a protective order, it's a serious offense, has some pretty significant legal consequences.
So Lisa got a protective order against Malik, which shows she was taking steps to protect herself and her daughter. But as we know, tragically, that wasn't enough. Just 11 days later, Lisa and her 9-month-old daughter, Labria, are found murdered. And Malik is the prime suspect.
This case is particularly heartbreaking because it really underscores the limitations of the legal system, right? A protective order, it's a powerful tool, but it's not an impenetrable shield. It's only effective if the abuser chooses to abide by it. And as we've seen in Malik's case, he demonstrated a complete disregard for the law, for human life.
It's a grim reminder that, legal measures, they're important, but they can't always prevent these tragedies. And in Malik's case, it seemed like the violence was escalating with each subsequent crime. The brutality just intensified. He became more brazen than his actions.
You're making a keen observation. The case of Lisa and Labria's murder, it remains unsolved. That the circumstances are eerily similar to what would become his final act of violence.
That's right. It's almost like a foreshadowing of the horrific crime that would bring him back to the forefront of the justice system. So it's 2019, and this is where the story takes its most tragic turn. Malik's own daughter, Dominique, the same child he had so brutally assaulted years earlier, becomes his final victim.
This is where the case goes beyond just like a pattern of violence, right? And enters like the realm of the truly horrific. Dominique, now 43 years old, struggling with addiction, is found murdered and dismembered.
Oh, wow.
Her remains discarded in a shopping cart.
The brutality of this crime is just staggering. What was the reaction when this news broke?
I mean, the public was horrified. This wasn't just another murder in a city, plagued by violence. This was a deeply personal crime. A betrayal of the most fundamental bond, parent and child.
And this time, there was no escaping justice. The investigation very quickly focused on Malik, and a key witness emerged, Dominique's own daughter.
Right. Dominique's daughter revealed that Malik had been increasingly hostile towards Dominique, disgusted by her addiction, often threatening her with violence. She recalls him saying, and I quote, "You're lucky I don't have a thing pistol."
Chilling words, especially considering his history. So the prosecution had a clear motive and a witness placing Malik in a threatening position. What was his defense?
Well, the defense tried to paint a picture of Dominique as a victim of circumstance, arguing that her addiction led her into some dangerous territory. Within Baltimore's drug trade, they suggested she was killed by someone involved in that world, attempting to shift the blame away from Malik.
Sounds like a pretty desperate attempt to create reasonable doubt. Did the jury buy it?
No, they didn't. The prosecution presented, I think, a really compelling case, highlighting Malik's history of violence, his specific threats against Dominique, and his suspicious behavior in the days following her disappearance.
What kind of suspicious behavior?
So Malik's ex-fiancée, she testified that he'd been gone for this unusually long period on the day Dominique disappeared, and he returned with scratches on his arms and neck. His explanation was that he had burned himself on antifreeze while fixing his van.
Okay.
But the prosecution pretty easily poked holes in that story.
So weak alibi, a history of violence, and direct threats against the victim. Sounds like the prosecution had a pretty strong case.
They did, and in 2021, after this lengthy trial, Malik Samartaney was convicted of second-degree murder and unauthorized disposal of a body. While he was acquitted of first-degree murder, it was hardly a victory considering the gravity of the charges.
And then comes the sentencing. What was the outcome?
In February of 2022, Malik was sentenced to 41 years in prison. During the sentencing hearing, he made a surprising statement expressing remorse, but only for the murder of his son back in 1991. He claimed to have found God in prison
Okay.
and insisted that he would never kill again.
It's remarkable how often we hear these claims of redemption from violent criminals when they're facing a lifetime behind bars. Did the judge believe him?
Judge Jennifer Schiffer, while acknowledging his statements, she ultimately emphasized the need to protect the public from a man with such a long and brutal history of violence. She delivered this powerful statement, recognizing the devastating impact of Malik's actions on his victims and their families.
And those families, especially Dominique's daughter, were finally able to confront the man who had caused them so much pain.
Yeah, their victim impact statements were incredibly moving. They talked about the loving person Dominique was, the pain of her loss, and the fear they'd lived with for so long, knowing that Malik was out there, capable of such violence.
Malik Samartaney, a man who spent decades terrorizing those closest to him, is finally behind bars. But his story leaves us with a lot to think about.
It does. This case forces us to examine the complexities of domestic violence, the challenges of, preventing recidivism, and those systemic failures that allowed this cycle of violence to continue for so long. We have to ask ourselves, could any of this have been prevented?
That's the question that really lingers, isn't it? Were there missed opportunities to intervene? Could earlier intervention have saved lives? It's a difficult question, with no easy answers.
Yeah, it is. But maybe, just maybe, by understanding those factors that contribute to these cycles of violence, we can work towards a future where these tragedies are less likely to occur.
This deep dive has been heavy, but I think it's been important. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please know that you are not alone. There are resources available. There is hope. We've included some helpful links in the show notes.
And remember, speaking up is crucial. Seeking help, reporting abuse, holding perpetrators accountable. These are all vital steps in breaking that cycle of violence.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.